Right, die recording is aan die gang. Louis laat wiel.
Right. Good evening to everybody. Again, my name is Louis de Wet. I handle the first chapters about conductivity, voltage, resistance, and so on. And so today we're taking it a step higher, doing first a little bit of chemistry. Again, if you don't like chemistry, I'll just try and make it as pleasant as possible to you. I know there's some concepts that will be quite new to you, but just bear with us. I don't think you'll be examined quite a lot on that, but I've seen in the past that certain principles need to be explained before we can even carry on further. So we're looking at semiconductors and the diode. So now if you look at three concepts, physics, chemistry, and electronics, they form an integral part of each other. The one complement the other. So tonight we're going to look at semiconductors, introduction to that, N-type and P-type semiconductors, the junction diode, half-wave, full-wave rectifiers, Zeners, and diodes and varicap diodes. And the last one, the diodes are switches. I think there's some problems there with the text. So we're just going to touch on that, but I'm not happy with what is written there. So let's just recap again what conductors are and insulators. This comes from the previous lecture. Materials in which electrons can move freely conduct electricity and is called conductors, obviously. The characteristics of conductors: electrons can flow freely because they are not strongly bound to their nuclei. Electrons are free to move around in material as long as other electrons replace them where they move. That's a very important principle. Insulators: an electric insulator is I just want to can I hide this? Yeah. An electrical insulator is a material whose electrons do not flow freely and therefore make it very hard to conduct an electric current under the influence of an electric field. So what is not discussed in the text, and I feel it's very important, is the band theory of solids. Now, as we know, we get different types of solids, obviously conductors, insulators, and semiconductors. I'm just going to explain, and I simplified the diagrams. You can go in quite deeply with these things, but it's not necessary. And I'm just going to show you these couple of diagrams. So the left one is of a conductor. So what first is what we call the valence band. That's the inner electrons of a metal or a conductor which is bound closely to the nucleus of the atom. And then the conduction band, which is red, is the outermost shell of the atom where the electrons are freely shared with others and can move quickly around. So if you look down at the bottom in black, conductors, Rho, that's the resistivity of the conductor. It ranges between 10 to the minus 8 to 10 to the minus 6 ohms per meter. So they've got a low resistivity and their conductivity is quite high, up to 5.8 times 10 to the 7 Siemens per meter. So Siemens is the unit for conductivity. Now, if you look to the right, insulators, they've got an inner valence band where the electrons sit very tightly, and then what we call a forbidden band. If you look at PVC or any carbon-based materials, the forbidden band is such that electrons cannot move out of the from the atoms, and the conduction band is way above in a very small, thin band, which make insulators difficult or impossible to conduct electricity, even at high voltages. Now, if you look at the insulators, the resistivity it starts at 10 to the 7 ohms per meter, and it goes up to 10 to the 23 ohms per meter. And if you look in contrast to that of conductors, and for instance, wood has got a conductivity of 10 to the minus 14 Siemens per meter. Now, if you look at semiconductors, which are very interesting, you get an inner valence band, and then a thinner forbidden band, and then a conduction band on the outer. I'm going to show you very interesting things there. So the resistivity is between 10 to the minus 6 and 10 to the minus 7 ohms per meter, which is low. And then the conductivity is not as high as that of conductors. And you'll see here it's 1,000 Siemens per meter. So let's recap again. We've got the atom there, the inner atomic nucleus consisting of protons, positive charged particles, and neutrons, which not nutrients, neutrons, which have no charge. Then rotating or around the atom are electrons, which have got a negative charge. Now here's a very important atom which are used in semiconductors, and that's the silicon atom, which is element number 14 on the periodic table. So it's got a nucleus consisting of 14 protons and 14 neutrons in balance there. And then we've got electrons rotating around the nucleus, and we start in the inner section there, the K shell, that's the innermost orbital. We call it the orbital. It's got 2 electrons. Then the L shell, or the L orbital, which has 8 electrons. And then the M orbital, or M shell, that's the outer one. So that's the most relevant one we're going to talk about tonight, which concerns all the elements we are going to chat about. And in that M shell, or the outer shell, are 4 electrons. So there you see the electron configuration of silicon, 1s2, 2s2. So that's the 1s shell, and then the 2s2, and it's got 2 electrons, 2p6, 3s2, and 3p2. Let me show you how it works. And I'm just going to show you, I'll show you now a bit later. Here's the germanium atom. Now the germanium atom has got 32 protons, 41 neutrons, and then 32 electrons also. And at the bottom, there's the electron configuration, which I'll talk about now, a bit more in detail. So let's look. So we talk about electron configurations of conductors, and then we'll show you also that of the semiconductors. Now, many years ago, Niels Bohr was the father of the electron configuration model, how electrons revolve around an atom. So I talked about K and L and M and N. So the K shell is the inner orbital, which normally only has 2 electrons that rotates around the nucleus. And they're very close to and it's difficult to remove them. Then the L cell, that's shell number 2, it's got 2 subshells, S and P. There are also 2 electrons and 6 electrons in the P shell. Then and you'll see the atomic number there. Let's take the first one, aluminium is 13, 2, 2, 6, and then we go to the M shell, S, P, and D subshells. And then you'll see there's 2 in the inner subshell. So all these are filled up to the brim. So S and P in subshell L is filled to the brim, and in shell number 3, or the M shell, S shell is also filled to the brim. And now you see an interesting thing here with aluminium in the P shell, shell 3, the P suborbital, there's 1 free electron. Now you'll see a pattern that evolves, that is shown here. Now, if you look at chromium, which got a higher atomic number, you see the orbitals filled up. And then here's some space here at the M shell, the D M shell for chromium. And then there's 1 extra electron in the outer shell going to shell 4. So these are your conducting electrons. You'll see now, very interesting here, copper also filled up, 2, 2, 6, 2, 6, and the D shell is supposed to have 10 electrons, and that is filled up, and then the extra one goes up over to the shell 4, the S suborbital. Now, if you remember last week when I talked about the conductivity values of metals, there was a very interesting thing about silver. Now, silver is the most conductive element of all, and it's even a better conductor than gold. Now, if you look at gold first, you'll see it filled up right there because of the high atomic number, the 79 atomic number, is filled up right to shell 5, the D10 suborbital. And then the shell 6, the P shell, has got one electron in the outer shell there, it's S. Now, going back to silver, and there's the interesting that makes silver such a good conductor. The shell 4, the F suborbital, is actually empty. And there's an outer electron in shell 5, which in the S1, which hangs around there. It doesn't go back to shell 4. It hangs around there in shell 5 and the S suborbital. And that makes it a wonderful conductor. You'll see here now the energy levels, shell K, that's the diagram here. Shell K is your first level, NS1. It's quite a broad energy level, so you need a lot of energy relatively to get those electrons stripped from the nucleus. Then 2 and 3 is a bit narrower, and then your energy band, that's for the valence electrons, where we got the 1 electrons in the outer shells, that's very flexible. So those electrons can move around very easily. Now let's look at semiconductors. That's very interesting also. We start looking at this chemistry, it's always wonderful to see what's going on here. So I've got the metals there again, the same configurations. And then we've got silicon, germanium, phosphor, arsenic, and boron. First, let's look at silicon. So the shell 1K, 2 electrons filled up. Shell 2L, the S suborbital is 2 electrons. The P suborbital is 6 electrons. Then we go to shell 3, and they're supposed to be, they're supposed to be 6 there. So we need 4 there. You'll see in the P orbital there's only 2, but we need 4 electrons to fill that up. And that's now a very important characteristic of silicon. It's only got 2 in the outer orbital, and it needs 4. Now, let's look here at phosphorus, which we are going to also look there. Phosphorus has got only 3 electrons in the outer shell, and it needs 3. So that's trivalent. We call it trivalent, okay? And then if you look at arsenic and so on, phosphorus is pentavalent. 2 and 3 is your outer orbitals, that's 5 electrons. And then boron is trivalent. If you have to add up these two. 2 and 1 is 3, that's trivalent, and phosphorus 2 and 3 is 5, that's pentavalent. So we go a bit further than that. So let's first look at silicon again. Silicon, as we said, we've got the 4 outer electrons, but we need 4. So if you bring silicon atoms together to each other, you'll see a silicon in the center, and then approached by other silicon atoms. You'll see each one has got 4 electrons, but we need 8. So when they get bound into a lattice or a crystal, you'll see that they are all filled. And that if you look at the central silicon atom, 2, 4, 6, 8, but it's shared. There's another silicon to its right, 2, 4, 6, 8, and above and below. So this is a very stable configuration of a silicon crystal. And at temperatures close to 0 Kelvin, nothing is happening there. So that's minus 273 degrees Celsius. That crystal stays static there. There's no movement of electrons, and they share the electrons, and they are in at a state of equilibrium where nothing happens. Now, you'll see there's a YouTube video reference there, and you can go and take a look at that, what they say, and I refer to it back again. Now, if you now heat up this crystal, it doesn't have to be heated up with a flame, but only, say by room temperature, you're very far from minus 273 degrees Celsius, and you start getting a free movement of electrons. in sort of not a, sort of a lazy fashion, these electrons start moving around in the crystal structure without being influenced by any external factors. And then they start jumping around. And you get what we call holes and then free electrons moving around, creating holes, filling up holes, and so it carries on. Now, let's look at the classification of semiconductors next. Now, we get two types of semiconductors. First off, the intrinsic and the extrinsic semiconductors. Now, first, the intrinsic is made up of only one type of atom, and usually that is silicon. Extrinsic semiconductors, so with them, if you take silicon, you add external impurities. Now, impurities is just other elements. It's not dirty materials. And they do it by the process of doping. Now, doping is you measure or you weigh off a very precise amount of silicon, and then you also weigh off a very precise amount of a doping material, and you melt the lot, and then you draw out the crystals. So go and read up about doping and how it's done. So the only thing that is done is the effect that you get is that you modify the conductivity of that crystal. And I'm going to explain that now. So doing that, you can either get P or N-type semiconductors. So first off, the P-type semiconductor, we're still on the first page. Bad news. We're going to have quite a lot to say. So you can follow page 129. So we'll do the P-type first. So, as I said about trivalent and pentavalent, trivalent items, and in the case of a P-type semiconductor, you only add trivalent atoms, such as boron, for instance. So these atoms have 3 electrons in the outer shell, and the dopants that you can add is either boron, aluminium, or gallium. So here's boron with its 3 outer electrons. And then you'll see, so if you take the 4 electrons of silicon that's on the outside and also shared by the others, but you only add boron, which has got 3 electrons that can be shared, there's a gap there. And that is what we call a hole. So that if you mix this boron homogeneously into a lot of silicon atoms, you get boron interspersed in this crystal structure at regular intervals with silicon. And there's the hole that we talk about. So that's an open space for an electron to jump to, as simple as that. So P-type electron semiconductors have got a trivalent atom that's added, and it always results in holes in the structure. So P-type semiconductors have an excess of holes, all right? And have a high tendency, obviously, to accept electrons. This is not just one little hole. There are billions of these little holes in a silicon or in a crystal consisting of these silicon atoms and then the dopants that you've added. So you can imagine all these little spaces where electrons can move between the material. Now, the N-type semiconductors, you always add a pentavalent atom to the semiconductor lattice. When you mix up all this stuff and you melt it and you cook it up and make sure it's mixed very well. And these items have 5 electrons in the outer shell. Examples of such dopants are obviously arsenic, phosphorus, and antimony. If you want to go back to that electron configurations, we can go take a look again there. And there we've got phosphorus, which has not got 4 outer valence electrons, but 5. So immediately it tells you that there's going to be 1 extra electron. And if you now take a P, you can see where it goes to. You've got a P type semiconductor and the N type, the one needing electrons and the one with holes, and the other one with excess electrons that it can donate. So we talk in chemistry about a donor and an acceptor. Okay, so there we've got phosphorus, and there you can see there's that electrons free, running around and looking for a place to settle themselves. It's not like a guy who doesn't have a house. You know, he's just looking somewhere for a place to live. Right, there's that reference again to the YouTube. It was quite difficult. I can't draw these figures, so my screenshots, and I give credit to this YouTube. I hope it's legal, and I apologize if it's I didn't have a choice. Right, so just a summary here that you can look at. And my previous, well, I think we wrote the exam 14 years ago, Etienne Odia. So this says EFN, we worked together on this presentation, and I've included some of these slides just to save some time. Let's recap there. An N-type semiconductor is created by doping silicon with phosphorus. N-type semiconductors have a larger electron concentration than a hole concentration. The phrase N-type comes from the negative charge of the electron. In N-type semiconductors, electrons are the majority carriers and holes are the minority carriers. The free electrons will be free to migrate around the crystal lattice and can serve as charge carriers, allowing a current to flow if a potential is applied. Typical chemical manipulation, phosphorus is added to silicon. And then a P-type semiconductor are created by doping an intrinsic semiconductor, that's silicon, with an acceptor impurities, or a doping N-type semiconductor. A common P-type dopant for silicon, in this case, is the trivalent boron. As opposed to the N-type semiconductors, P-type semiconductors have a larger hole concentration than the electron concentration. The phrase P-type refers to the positive charge of the hole. In P-type semiconductors, holes are the majority carriers and electrons are the minority carriers. Okay, so I think you've got the concept sorted out. If you have problems with that, don't worry too much. Go and read it up. And if you have questions, I'm always will be glad to help answer. Right, let's look at the junction diode. Now, if you take two small pieces of a P-type semiconductor and you make it in contact with a small piece of N-type semiconductor, then you get a junction. Now, here we see in that diagram is there on page 130. I'll just redraw it for a better illustration. So there on the right, you've got the N-type and then on the left, the P-type. So now, through electron movement, through what they call the depletion layer, the P-type gets negatively charged, and then the N-type is then positively charged. And that area between them is called the P-in junction. So you'll see here on page 30, it says, because the N-type material has some free electrons, just below the figure, some of them can migrate across the boundary and fill some of the holes in the lattice structure of the P-type material. This migration will leave the P-type material negatively charged. And this is now before, it was otherwise before they contacted each other. Okay. And then while the N-type material will become positively charged. This process will stop when the potential difference between the P-type and N-type materials is sufficient to prevent any further electron movement across the boundary. So this thing is now this dull junction, and the two layers are actually in equilibrium. Now they said, remember that the P and N-type materials were not positively and negatively charged to start with. They were both neutral since the extra electrons in the N-type material were balanced by the additional positive charges on the nuclei of the phosphorus and arsenic atoms used for doping. Similarly, the lack of electrons in the P-type material is precisely balanced by the smaller positive charge on the nuclei of the boron and aluminum atoms. Now, so they also say here a very thin layer called the depletion layer or depletion region has now been formed at the junction between the P-type and N-type materials. where there are no or very few free charge carriers, since the free electrons from the N-type material have all been used up, filling the holes on the P-type side of the junction. The depletion layer is usually very thin, and they say it's about 1 micron. So there's your junction. Right, so, and just in conclusion there, the N-type material has some free electrons which can migrate across the boundary and will fill some of the holes in the lattice structure of the P-type material. Right, we've just read paragraphs 3 to 5 there on page 30, so what I mentioned there. Right, so next up, if you page around at page 130, on the bottom of page 130, they say, now suppose we apply a potential across the junction with the positive terminal attached to the P-type material and the negative terminal attached to the N-type material. And here it is in this diagram. So below here, you've got a little battery with the positive side on the left of the battery, negative on the right. So what's going to happen? So if we look at the diagram, electron flow will come from the negative terminal, will flow to the right, and then up into the N-type block of material there, of the semiconductor. Now the battery, the force of the battery, or depending on the voltage, will then pump electrons into the N-type material, right in there, and towards the depletion region. Similarly, the positive potential applied to the P-type material will attract electrons away from the depleted region. So when these electrons go through the barrier, it will fill up the holes that are in the P-type. So there's your depletion layer, and it goes up and it fills the layer. So electrons will flow through the circuit, as we can call it, and then you'll get an equilibrium situation again. So what we talk also there is the forward bias voltage. You say here on the second paragraph of page 131. All right, so there's a minimum amount of current that has to flow that has to be generated before this flow of electrons can take place. It just doesn't. It just can't start at zero, so you need a little bit of current, and it says here in the second paragraph, to make this current flow, there must be sufficient potential difference to overcome the potential difference that existed across the junction. There's the word that I was looking for, between the N-type and P-type materials, due to the migration of electrons from the N-type material to the P-type material when the depletion layer was formed. This voltage is known as the forward bias voltage. I'm sure it does, which is typically between 500 and 800 millivolt for silicon PN junctions. You see it on the slide, and around 100 to 200 millivolt. So that's 0.5 to 0.8 in the case of silicon, and 0.1 to 0.2 volt for germanium junctions. If the potential difference applied is less than this bias voltage, electrons won't be forced into the depletion region of the N-type side, or being removed from the P-type side. So the depleted region will still not have any free charge carriers, and no current will flow. So you have to overcome that minimum amount of current, right, that you need to get the electron flowing through that P and N-type semiconductors. So, okay, let's see what happens if the potential is connected the other way around, with a positive terminal attached to the N-type material and the negative terminal to the P-type material. Right, so now we've switched the battery around, and we've got the negative terminal on the left, and electrons is flowing into the P-type material. And what happens? It just fills up the holes, and it accumulates there, and there it's stuck. And you get extra electrons just hanging around there. So the overall P-type section of material gets negatively charged, and because of a loss of electrons in the n-type, the n-type material is obviously positively charged. So here we say it, electrons are forced into the p-type material, making it more negatively charged, and then subsequently electrons are removed from the n-type material, making it more positively charged. So you can see here also, let's look at the paragraph just below the diagram on page 131. The effect of the applied potential is to force more electrons into the p-type material, making it more negatively charged, as you'll see there in the diagram, and remove electrons from the n-type material, making it more positively charged. This movement of charges simply results in more holes in the p-type material being filled by the additional electrons, and more of the free electrons being removed from the n-type material, increasing the depth of the depletion layer and increasing the potential difference across the junction until it equals the potential difference from the outside. After a very brief initial current, no further current will flow except a tiny current known as the reverse leakage current, which is typically less than 1 microampere. This situation is known as the reversed biased PN junction. Now, you will obviously ask yourself now, how far can I push this thing until it blows up? So there are limits, and I've seen diodes pop or just explode if you put too much reverse current in them. So you can try it out yourself if you're not scared, but wear your safety equipment or start with small diodes. It's, yeah, I don't want to, how shall I say it, get you into trouble there. But it does happen. If the voltage and current is too high, that diode will certainly not last. Okay, all right, we've done page 131. And we can ask questions later again. Here's a diode. This is a very old diode, which I took a photo of my microscope. And this circle is not on the right place. It just has to move a little bit to the right. And then you'll see there a little shiny disc. That is the PN, the semiconductor junction now. So this device is called a junction diode, or often diode for short. Okay, so we're halfway with our time. In this circuit, the symbol is as follows. We've got the direction of current flow, and then the anode, and then the cathode sides of the diode. Right, let's go over to what we use these diodes for. And the first, if you just have time, just read on page 132 about the reverse bias and the current. And there's a graph there, page 132, voltage versus current for a semiconductor diode. Read this section very carefully and see if you can understand what the graph means there. So there's a bit of self-study there. So now we're going to look at the half-wave rectifier. So diodes are commonly used as rectifiers to convert AC voltages into DC voltages. And I think you all know what we're talking about. Now, for example, consider this circuit, which is known as the half-wave rectifier. And you'll see there's on the left, there's a variable alternating current source going through the diode and then to the other side. And that's your V in, your voltage in, and then you get the voltage out, right? So what is actually happening is the output voltage follows the input voltage during the positive half cycles. So the positive half cycles, or the positive half cycles go through, but the negative ones do not go through or pass through the diode. So the output voltage follows the input voltage during the positive half cycles. And you'll see that's the red graph there. So when it goes to the negative half cycle, obviously there's no voltage going through, and that is 0 volts. So then you get another peak of the positive cycle. So it's actually always a slightly less than the input voltage, which is the blue graph. And you'll see that it's a bit higher there. And that's due to the forward bias voltage, which is 0.6 volt, which it loses. During the negative half cycles, the diode does not conduct and the output voltage is 0. So, and you see it very nice. The graph shows the input, the blue, and the output voltages, which is 0.6 volts lower. Okay, I've put this in just for extra information, and then we'll go to the full wave rectifier. So you'll see the top graph, the unfiltered output of the half wave. This is what you get out, your output. There you see these little peaks. One peak and then 0 volts, another peak, 0 volts, another peak with 0 volts. So we're going to talk about what you or maybe can use. You put a capacitor on your output. So when the pulse does arrive, it charges the capacitor back to full charge as shown on the right. The thick line shows the charge, discharge waveform. So if you at the capacitor, so at the end of the capacitor, you get a charge and then a little bit of a decrease in the voltage. It charges up and increases again and it goes down. It forms a bit of a sawtooth type of voltage that comes out, and it's not very good for whatever you're going to use it for. So it has a relatively reasonably constant DC voltage, but with a ripple voltage. So you see also the graph at the bottom. You see the capacitor charging, the dark section, and then the blue section. It discharges. It charges up again, and it discharges again. So you don't have a very smooth voltage coming out. But now, and this is only one when you use one diode. Now, if you look at page 134, you'll see half-wave rectifiers suffer from excessive ripple because they give 0 voltage output just over half of the cycle. The full wave rectifier shown below is better in this regard, and you'll see the diagram here. Now they say when V in is positive, D1, you'll see the voltage going through there, and D3 will conduct, and you'll see the voltage here again. Yeah, so it goes through your V out, and it goes through your whatever you're connected to, maybe a transistor or whatever. So your voltage goes through D1, through out, it comes back again, and it goes through D3 and back again to your cycle. So it goes that cycle, all right? Then when V1 is positive. When V in is negative, now it goes first, it goes through, where am I now? All right. So it goes through D4, and it's supposed to go through, wait a minute, what did it go right here? Let's just see. And when D2, and yeah, D2 and D4 will conduct. So, yeah, obviously, it's true. So it goes through D4, it goes through your V out, and it comes back again to D2, and it goes through there again. Then it switches over, it goes through there, and your cycle repeats again. So this cycle is known as a full wave bridge rectifier. So whatever cycle it is, in a positive or negative cycle, you'll get a constant voltage out of there. Now, it's very interesting. The output voltage has got a certain frequency. So the output voltage is now positive during both the positive and negative cycles of the input voltage. So what you get here, even though your voltage goes, your voltage goes up, and you've got a positive cycle there, it goes down, you've got a positive cycle there. Then it goes up again and down again. But now you'll see that the output voltage is 1.2 volt lower because you've got now two 0.6 forward voltage drops, and you add them together, you get 1.2 volt. So note also that the frequency of the ripple, this ripple here, the frequency is twice the frequency of the input frequency. So once again, the amount of ripple on the output can be greatly reduced by using a suitable smoothing capacitor as a low-pass filter on the output. So Henry is going to talk about power supplies Thursday, and this forms now the basis of a power supply, that you need a relatively constant voltage that comes from your transformer and the alternating current, and that is rectified by your set of 4 diodes, which forms the full wave rectifier, which goes to the output of your power supply, which is smoothed by the capacitance on. But then we will talk a bit more than that later. I'm just laying the basis here. So I've just made another diagram here. So so when V in is positive, D1 and D3 will conduct. So if it goes there, D1, it goes through into your receiver, whatever, it runs through there and it comes back there into. So you'll see this, it can't go through there, it can't go through there. So just to understand that, goes through there, D1 goes through the your receiving component, and it goes through D3 and back there. Right, so now, if the opposite, it goes, where am I now, D2, it goes through D4, right through your, this line there, it can't go there, it goes through your receiving component, through D2 and D4. So let's, you'll see there. Right, so you can look at it. Right, here's another way of representing these, how they normally present it. You'll see here are the 4, but they're normally in the diagrams for the power supply. It's shown like this. Here you've got your alternating current coming in through your transformer, step down transformer, and you'll see your first, I'm just going to show you there's 2 cycles. All right, so there it goes, first cycle, goes through there, goes through your load, comes back there, up through there, through D1, back through your cycle. All right, so there it goes like that. Then the phase is, then the electricity goes the other way in a fraction of a second, and it goes again through that diode there, again through your load, then it goes there, through D2 and back. So you'll see it, let me show it that way again. Interesting. Yeah, but you'll see it on your on your presentation when you can look at it on YouTube. So there we've got a full wave rectifier with a capacitor filter, and then we will talk about more. But the effect that you get a very smaller ripple there with your smooth output voltage. You get the unsmooth output voltage from your transformer, and then it's rectified, and through a capacitor you get and these voltages are very small. It all depends on the sophistication of your power supply. Right, here we're going to look at this the Zener diode, and this is a very interesting type of diode. On page 135, they say in most diodes the reverse breakdown voltage should never be exceeded, and that's where your diode explodes. Or they say, they put it very mildly, permanently damaged, but it actually explodes. I can show you that. And with a loud bang. So the diode may be permanently damaged. However, a very specific type of diode, the Zener diode, is manufactured in which the reverse breakdown voltage can be safely exceeded. And that's a very nice characteristic of the Zener diode. Zener diodes are also manufactured in such a way that the reverse breakdown voltage, also known as the Zener voltage, it's abbreviated as VZ, is specified and carefully controlled. So Zener diodes are available with Zener voltage ranging between 2 volt and 100 volt. And I know you can also run large electric motors and control the voltage across these motors with Zener diodes. Right, here we've got a little diagram here, and I'm going to explain what happens. And the Zener diode is mostly used for voltage regulation. It's a good voltage regulator. So this diagram shows an input voltage in a range of 6 to 10 volt there on the left, being applied across a reverse biased Zener diode. So the current flow through there in this way through a resistor, and I'll explain the purpose of the resistor. And it goes, there's your reverse biased Zener voltage of 5 volt. Now this voltage that comes in here is 6 to 10 volts. So the purpose of a resistor is to limit the current flowing through the Zener diode and prevent it from being destroyed. Right? So the resistor aids in ensuring that not too much voltage goes through the Zener diode. So the current flowing through the Zener diode causes a voltage drop against the resistor. So it takes off current and the voltage drops for the resistor, which is then close to 5 volt. In this way, the circuit maintains and goes up very quickly, up and down very quickly, at to keep it at a fairly constant output voltage of about 5 volt, irrespective of both the input voltage and the current draw by the load. So the load draws also current. So these two work in a pair, regulating the voltage going out. So the reversed bias Zener diode functions as a voltage regulator, maintaining a constant output voltage despite fluctuations in the input voltage and load current. But just remember, it is within specific parameters. So your input voltage, say if your Zener diode is listed for 10 volt, don't put 30 or 40 volts through it. It will blow it. So it's not ensured that it will not fail. So you'll have to keep within the parameters of what it can handle to ensure that you get a 5 volt output there. So this is a type of a cycle, a feedback type of cycle, where a very close regulation of voltages can be effected, which is also used in power supplies, as you will see. Right, let's look at the VariCap diode. Right, they say, I think back to the physical description of the reversed bias P injection. It consists of two conducting materials, obviously P and N-type, separated by a very thin non-conducting depletion layer. As we said, it's about 1 micron. This description is very similar to this description of a capacitor. So you've got two conducting plates separated by a thin insulating layer, and you can vary the capacitance by moving the plates apart or closer to each other. Indeed, all reversed bias diodes do act as capacitors to some extent. Most diodes are designed to minimize the capacitance effect so that it becomes negligible except at very high frequencies. So you have to read this through again and to make sure that you understand also the circuit diagram below. However, some diodes are designed to maximize this capacitance effect and to allow the capacitance to be controlled by the reverse bias voltage applied to the diode. So the reverse bias voltage controls the capacitance of the VariCap diode, which is brilliant. Remember that the greater the reverse bias voltage, now this is the interesting thing here, the greater the reverse bias voltage, the larger the depletion layer. Okay. And this change in layer thickness is equivalent to moving plates of a capacitor further apart. And then, in other words, capacitance will be reduced. So the more voltage you put in, the larger the depletion layer, and then a reduction in capacitance. These are called VariCap, or variable capacitance diodes. An alternative term, therefore, is the varactor diode. So yeah, this circuit symbol for a VariCap diode is approximately a combination of the symbols for a diode and for a capacitor. Now, if you look at the circuit, you see a DC bias voltage, a V bias, there on the left, is used to reverse bias a VariCap diode, D1. So there you see the symbol, a diode combined with a capacitor. So the voltage goes through this inductor and it reverse biases onto D1. As the bias voltage is changed, the capacitance of DH also changes. So the higher the voltage, the lower the capacitance. This change in capacitance will vary the resonant frequency of the parallel tuned circuit made up of L2, you've got L2, C1, and D1. So this D1, C1, and L2 is a resonant circuit. I'm sure you did come across it with your previous lectures. Just note that the capacitance in the parallel tuned circuit consists of C1 there in series with a varicap diode. Yeah. So L1 prevents the AC, there you go, signals present in the tuned circuit from flowing through the bias voltage source, which would introduce undesirable losses into the tuned circuit, reducing its Q. That's the, sorry, I can't remember that symbol. Similarly, C1 prevents the DS bias voltage from being shorted through L2. So when you come to oscillators, just read this through and see if you understand this. Circuits like this is often used to vary the frequency of oscillators. That is, circuits which generate AC signals at very specific frequency. And you'll get to oscillators soon. So now, this last section on diodes and switches, I've got a problem there. So I'm just going to look at this again in detail and see if I can get more information. But I'm not 100% happy with the text there. So let's skip this diodes and switches and I'll get back to you on that one. Then the last one is what we call this the LED. I'm just going to read that for you. If the semiconductor material and doping are appropriately chosen, the energy state of transition about the junction can emit electromagnetic energy. Such a diode is known as a LED, and we all know LEDs. LEDs are available in different wavelengths, from infrared to visible to ultraviolet. The first LEDs were red, green, and yellow. You know how they look. So, but nowadays there's a full complement of a lot of different LEDs. Sophisticated displays, example for TV sets, can be made combined by combining LEDs in the three primary emission colors, red, green, and blue, into each pixel. If all three are turned on, a white color is emitted. With different combinations of intensities, virtually any color can be reproduced. So you can just read there further about LEDs. Right, in summary, pure semiconductors do not conduct current at room temperature. So yeah, they do conduct at very low temperatures. However, by introducing small amounts of impurities, things like phosphorus or boron and so on, they can be made to conduct the current. The charge carriers in the N-type semiconductors are negatively charged electrons, while in the P-type semiconductors, they are positively charged holes, right? When N-type and P-type semiconductors are brought into contact, a thin depletion layer with no free charge carriers forms at the junction. If the junction is forward biased by making the P-type material positive with respect to the N-type layer, a current will flow, provided the potential exceeds the forward bias voltage, as we mentioned, of the junction, which is typically about 600 millivolt or 0.6 volt for silicon devices. If the junction is reverse biased by making the P-type material negative with respect to the N-type material, no current will flow until the reverse breakdown voltage is reached. The PN junction is used to make an electronic device called the junction diode, which we have discussed. The diode, we don't normally say junction diode, we just say diode, has two terminals, the anode, which is connected internally to the P-type material, and the cathode, which is connected to the N-type material. If the anode is made positive with respect to the cathode by 600 millivolt or so, and that's the forward bias voltage, a current will flow through the diode. Diodes are commonly used as rectifiers. In a half-wave rectifier, only the positive half cycle is rectified. So there's a substantial amount of ripple at the AC frequency, which must be removed using a smoothing capacitor. In a full wave rectifier, both the positive and the negative half cycles are rectified, resulting in less ripple. In a full wave rectifier, the ripple frequency is twice the frequency of the AC input. In audio systems, this ripple is known as hum. Now just think about it. If you make your input frequency as high as possible, then obviously you're going to eliminate a lot of ripple. If your peaks and your valleys of your alternating current signal coming in is very close to each other. And when you halve that, the amount of ripple will be greatly significantly reduced. So that's these more sophisticated type of the power supplies use very high frequency inputs. Right, Zener diodes have a well-controlled and specific reversed breakdown voltage, also known as the Zener voltage, and are designed not to be damaged by reverse breakdown. When reversed biased, Zener diodes act as voltage regulators. Varying gap diodes exhibit a capacitance when reverse biased that decreases as the reverse bias voltage is increased. Right, then PIN diodes are often used as switches at radio frequencies, but I think I'll put that with our next session when we talk about transistors. Light emitting diodes, LEDs, provide light in virtually any color very efficiently. The forward drop of an LED is typically much higher than for simple junction diodes. Okay, so that is the lecture, and I've got the questions. I copied them and put it on the slides. So Henry, wil jy laat ons die almal inkry, dan kan hulle saam terugvoering gee soos ons deur die vrae gaan.
Dis reg, Louis, ek sal hierso, dis altyd makliker as hulle dit in die chat doen. So jy doen die vrae, hulle skree wat hulle dink in die chat en ek sal terugvoer gee soos wat ons deurgaan.
Alright, so moet ek maar deur die vrae gaan en lees en so, nee.
Ja, lees die vrae en dan vra jy, dan kyk ons wie antwoord en dan
alright.
Kyk ons wie verskil van ons en so voorts.
Ja. Okay. Question 1. The forward biased diode junction will A. Forward biased, that's important. Allow current to flow through the junction. Block current, B, that's block current from flowing. C, have a high resistance. Or D, exhibit a Zener diode function. Okay, dis antwoord.
Maar daar is nog niemand wat geantwoord het nie, maar antwoord maar Louis.
Is hulle nog daar?
Ek glo so.
Are you there? I know it's boring.
Yeah, we're waiting for you.
I beg your pardon?
Hy sê hy wag vir jou, Louis.
Oh, yeah, but you must answer. Now I expect you to answer the questions. Please just attempt to answer the questions, you know.
I believe it's A.
Yeah, there you go. You're right. Allow current to flow through the junction. Okay. Right, number 2. In a silicon diode, the voltage of 600 millivolt or 0.6 volt refers to A, the breakdown voltage, B, the forward bias voltage, C, the Zener voltage, or D, the cutoff voltage.
Again, A, the breakdown voltage.
Just think about it again. Let me just read it to you.
Isn't it D, the cutoff?
Okay, I'll just read this paragraph again on page 131. This voltage is known as the forward bias voltage, which is typically between 500 and 800 millivolt in silicon PN junctions. Okay,
So it's B, forward bias
B.
voltage.
That's correct. Yes. Question 3. Which of the following components is intended only to operate in the reverse biased condition? A. Rectifier diode. B. Zener diode. C. Polarized capacitor. Or D. A resistor.
Zener diode B.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay.
On the way to pros.
Okay. Question 4. The term VZ is commonly used to describe A. The Zener diode regulating voltage, the Zener diode impedance, the forward voltage applied to the diode, or the peak voltage of the rectified waveform.
A.
Yes, correct. Yeah, the Zener diode regulating voltage. That's correct. Excellent. I'm sure you're all going to pass this exam. It's not so difficult. Right. By only allowing alternating current to flow in one direction, a diode can be used. A as an attenuator, B an amplifier, C a rectifier, or D a fuse.
Rectifier.
Right, 5C, that's correct. Okay, number 6, Zener, and this is more or less the type of questions that you're gonna get. It's they're not gonna try and flunk everybody. Zener diodes there's such a scarcity of radio hams that really cannot make it too difficult. Zener diodes are used to start oscillations. Sorry, I'm not trying to insult everybody.
Regular
Right, Zener
DC
diodes.
voltage supply.
Now say D, 6D. All right. Right. What function does a full wave bridge bridge circuit serve? Amplification, coupling, rectification, isolation. Easy.
7C.
See. All right. A circuit which only allows half of an AC waveform to pass through is called a regulator, bridge circuit, attenuator, of half wave rectifier.
Half wave rectifier.
D, that's correct. Right. A full diode circuit to provide full wave rectified DC from a transformer is called a balanced circuit, a bridge rectifier, a dummy load, or a regulator.
B. Wheatstone bridge.
A bridge rectifier, you say B, yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay. The area of a diode junction where no free holes or electrons exist is called the anode, cathode, depletion region, or semiconductor.
B. Cathode.
The junction.
Or the junction, the inside.
Yeah, where no free holes or electrons exist. Yeah. There it is. I think you got it now, 10. What was the last one that you said?
B for cathode. That's what was said.
Okay, let's think about this.
Depletion
That's
region.
area of diode junction.
Semiconductor, probably. No free electrons. Isn't it depleted over there?
There you go. Yeah.
10C.
Is ek nou reg, Henry? Ja. Depleted
Ja,
region.
yeah,
Yeah.
depletion region.
From moment I also a PN type semiconductor refers to a two-pin transistor, a capacitor, a diode, or there you go, 11C.
A diode.
The diode, yeah. I hope I didn't go too quickly, but just go and read through it and so on. And if you do you have any questions now, then we can discuss anything that you want to discuss. I've got a half an hour time if you want to go through anything.
You covered it well, Louis.
Okay. The
Louis,
chemistry
ek
doesn't. Yes.
Ja, Louis, ek dink wat 'n ou basies maar moet onthou is dat wat is 'n diode? Wat is 'n
Yes.
Zener diode en wat
Ja.
is 'n Vericap? Dis al.
Okay.
As jy
Ek
weet
kan-
wat daai goeters, dan gaan jy
Ja.
definitief dit slaag. En vir interessantheidshalwe, die tuners in die AV receivers werk nog steeds presies dieselfde. Daar word 'n voltage op die tuner toegepas om die tuner se frekwensie te verander. So die prosessor pas 'n voltage op die tuner toe om die tuner te tune na 'n spesifieke frekwensie toe. So daai presiese
So that's-
circuit wat jy nou verduidelik is, word vandag nog
For the
gebruik.
the Vericap.
Dis reg, ja.
Waar, hè? Ja. Please feel free to ask any questions. I have a lot of time to answer anything. They're not going to ask you any of these chemistry questions, but I thought it was important that you just get a basic background of what it's
The
all
extra
about.
electron that is carried over and
Yeah.
yeah, it's just giving the
Yeah.
conductivity basically of two element and
Yeah. If you
giving
yeah.
the directional understanding why
Yeah.
it allows for the single direction and not the other way.
That's correct. And the holes and the electrons and how they fill it up. It's very diagrammatic. Maybe it's not even happening like that if you look through a very good microscope. But this is, through deduction and measurement, this is what they get. Yeah. Okay, but these are very important concepts. If you understand this, you understand semiconductors. Okay,
Right, ek gaan die recording stop, nee.
Okay, good.
I still wonder what